So as folks will recall, usually when I'm sitting here, I'm talking about something called the 108 Gates of Dharma-Illumination, which shows up in one version of Dogen's Shobogenzo. He didn't write it, but he clearly thought it was important. It's mostly a quote from another text, and he gave us some advice and admonition to pay attention to these 108 gates. So I've been talking about one gate per week since 2016. So it's, golly, it's a long time with this text. So today we are at gate 97. Accretion of happiness is a gate of Dharma-Illumination, for it benefits all living beings. So you look at accretion of happiness and you just go, what's going on? This is not a phrase we normally hear. So this word that's translated happiness here can mean blessings, good fortune, good luck, wealth, right? It can also be action that leads to good things, or action that leads to merit. Now this is sounding a little more familiar, right? So accretion of happiness could be read accumulation of merit. That sounds more like what we might expect, right? Accumulation of merit. So it starts to make more sense in a Dharma context, because often we say, well, happiness, what is this thing about personal happiness? And is that really what we're in this for? So instead, let's think about this as accumulation of merit. So merit, Japanese kudoku or Sanskrit punya. Maybe you have encountered these two, or these are more familiar. So literally virtue or power of good deeds. In other words, karmic consequences, right? What happens when we do stuff? Consequences of our actions with body, speech, and mind. So traditionally, the abstract positioning of this was as a sort of spiritual wealth that you could earn and pile up and spend, right? In the service of something, right? So you accumulated merit through your good actions, and then you dedicated to other beings who needed some kind of help or support or something, right? So punya can be thought of as something which is sort of karmically fruitful, right? You do something and some fruit is the result of that. Some wholesome result of a wholesome action by a bodhisattva results in merit. So traditionally it can be accumulated. So, you can heap up this punya, heap up this merit. But bodhisattvas transfer that merit to all beings, right? To help beings with their awakening, rather than keeping it for themselves. So if we're out there doing bodhisattva activity, good, wholesome, beneficial, skillful bodhisattva activity, we're generating merit, we're collecting, gathering, heaping up this merit, but we're not keeping it for ourselves. We're not doing those good things in order to get some reward for ourselves. So the purpose, after liturgy, after we chant something, there's always an echo, right? There's a dedication of merit. So the purpose of that echo, after we chant that text in that service, is to transfer that merit to somebody, some kind of other beings. Maybe it's all beings, maybe it's specific beings. So we've generated benefits by our chanting, but the purpose of that chanting is not to keep all of that good stuff for ourselves. It's to dedicate that to Buddhas or ancestors or beings who are suffering or something, right? So we chant a text, there's an echo. We chant two more texts, there's an echo. We might wonder why that's there. It's about the dedication of merit. So echo have a standard three-part form, which is good to know if you ever have to write one. And some of us do from time to time. There are some standard echoes, but it's perfectly possible, as we will see when we say goodbye to this building, there are times we need to write our own. There's a specific purpose, there's a specific event or something, and we need to write an echo. So it's good to know those echo are not random. They have a form. There is an arc to that story. So you don't just traditionally kind of say any old thing in any old way that you want. There's three parts. So the first part is how that merit was generated. What did we do to generate that merit? So it's usually something like having, offered tea, water, sweets, and food, and chanted the, Heart of Great Perfect Wisdom Sutra. Having done such and such and such, which generates merit, right? The second part is who is receiving that merit? Who are we sending it to? Who are we dedicating it to? We dedicate the merit of our chanting to the great, usually, like in the morning, to the great teacher Shakyamuni Buddha, the great ancestor Heidogen, eminent ancestor Keizan Jokin, successive ancestors who transmitted the light of Dharma and the eternal three treasures in the 10 directions, right? So where are we throwing it back? We specifically name, in some cases, who we're throwing it back. In the case of this one, Heart Sutra is the first text we do, and typically we throw that merit back to one Buddha, two founders. So it's Shakyamuni and Dogen and Keizan. Third part of an echo is what we hope for as a result of this transfer of merit. So we're transferring this merit to beings or to somebody specific. What are we hoping as an outcome? And it might be something like, may the true Dharma flourish in the 10 directions, may all nations dwell together in harmony, may peace and tranquility pervade this Sangha, and may all beings live together joyfully. If you're here in the morning, all those words are very familiar, right? This is what we do every morning. So having done something, chanted Heart of Great Wisdom, we're dedicating it to this group of beings in hopes that practice Dharma flourishes, everybody's happy and harmonious, and suffering comes to an end. So traditionally, you can't write an echo kind of just any old way. You also can't just chant any old text to generate merit and then put an echo after it, right? It has to be a text that generates merit, typically a sutra, a dharani, sometimes individuals in small groups, or those of us who maybe want to create some liturgy for ourselves at home, might not know what the form is, might not know that there's an arc to that story, and we kind of want to chant whatever we like. Maybe there's a piece of poetry, maybe there's an essay. It's a nice performance. It's not, traditional Soto Zen liturgy in the way that this is created, right? We're doing something to generate merit, throw it back. So certain things get included in a certain order for a certain reason, and that's kind of how generation of merit by liturgy works. So chanting the bodhisattva vows does not generate merit. It's a wonderful thing to do. It helps our aspiration, right? Reminds us what we're doing, but it doesn't generate merit. Repentance verse doesn't generate merit. Also very helpful for us personally, not a merit generating text. So those things have other purposes in our practice. So in our morning service here, we do the two most common texts because we do the short form of a standard Soto Shu morning service. The long form goes something like 45 minutes or an hour. It's actually 5 services within one service, that long form. So we do the Heart Sutra and we do the Daihi Shindarani. And in the world of Soto Zen, we dedicate, as I say, the merit of the Heart Sutra to one Buddha, 2 founders. That's the typical thing we do. We dedicate the Daihi Shu to all those who are ill or are deceased within a certain period of time. So in the longer standard service, we might include the Sandokai or the Hokkyo Zammai and then dedicate that to the lineage. That's where we chant all the ancestors. So sometimes you may have been to a service where we chant all the ancestors from the 7 Buddhas before Buddha all the way down through Keizan. That's part of an echo. We're listing all the people that we're dedicating this merit to. Sometimes there are chapters of the Lotus Sutra that we dedicate to temple founders or to temple patrons, important people in the history of our temple, past abbots maybe, right? So the point of all that chanting is to serve all beings of past, present, and future by generating merit and sending that merit to them. So there are teachings that say this is the way to protect punya, or to protect merit, right? We gather up all of this merit from our good and meritorious deeds, and the way we protect that is to throw it back. So if the bodhisattva's intention in accumulating merit is to transfer it, immediately turn around and transfer that to all beings, that's a selfless act, right? That's a selfless intention. So the merit then is real. The merit is effective in helping other beings because it doesn't come as part of our personal grasping, clinging attachment, right? Which is really interesting. It only becomes effective if we're not clinging to it. This starts to sound familiar in other places in our practice, right? Things are only effective if we're not clinging to them. So there are other things we do in this tradition that generate merit. You might remember during Buddha's birthday, everyone has the chance to come up and pour tea or sweet water over the baby Buddha. That is a merit-generating activity. Making offerings on an altar or to an altar, which is not only fancy like food, tea, sweets, offerings, it's simply lighting a candle. It's offering incense. It's taking care of the flowers. All of those things are offering, right? Circumambulating while chanting sutras amplifies the merit. So anyone who is involved with anything we do, like at Los Angeles Soto Shu, like Mark would have seen us circumambulating during the run-up to the Jukai. We were doing a lot of chanting for ancestors, recognizing, doing a lot of memorials. So if you're moving, chanting in a certain pattern, that amplifies, right, the merit. Chanting names of Buddha is a way to generate merit. And we don't think about that here. We think, well, that's what Pure Land folks do, right? Chanting names of Buddha, chanting Amitabha or something. Actually, that is not just a Pure Land exercise. We do it every time we do an oryoki meal. So those of us who do Friday morning oryoki meal, think about where we get to that point where we have 10 names of Buddha. Vairochana Buddha, Pure Dharmakaya, Lochana Buddha, Complete Sambhogakaya, right? 10 names of Buddha. We're generating merit by that. So that is not separate from what we do in our own practice. So traditionally, sponsoring the printing of sutras or sponsoring the distribution of Dharma materials is a huge way to generate merit. Supporting the Sangha was considered to be very powerful because the Sangha is what? A group of bodhisattvas. We're out there, practicing, generating merit, transferring a lot of merit simply because of the practice that we're doing and the fact that a Sangha has come together and is living by vow, we hope. So someone's donations are making that possible. So the person who is donating gets to share in that generation of merit. So this is a huge merit creation, gathering opportunity. Simply supporting practice and supporting bodhisattvas is a huge way to generate merit, right? So we think, well, the Sangha, that's pretty powerful. Supporting Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha is a powerful thing when it comes to the merit, right? And yet, there's this famous story that I'm sure everybody has heard when Bodhidharma arrives in China and has his audience, there's nodding back there, has his audience with Emperor Wu, right? And he says, Emperor says, I've built these monasteries, I've had sutras copied, I've allowed for a lot of ordinations of new monks and new teachers and nuns, and surely I've generated a whole bunch of merit, right? And Bodhidharma says, there is no merit. And of course, he's taken aback by this. How can there be no merit? I've done all these wonderfully meritorious things supporting Buddhism, supporting the Dharma, supporting the Sangha. And Bodhidharma says, this merit you seek is only the petty reward that humans and devas obtain as a result of deeds that are tainted. It's like the reflection of a thing which conforms to it in shape, but it is not the real thing. Well, imagine you've done all this stuff and you think you're really quite a pious, merit-generating, individual, and what do you hear from Bodhidharma? There's no merit in any of that. It doesn't count. And you just go, this is not okay. This doesn't feel good, right? So the emperor says, well, what then is true merit? So, what should I have done instead? I did all this stuff, and you're telling me it wasn't okay, so what should I have done instead? Bodhidharma says, pure wisdom is marvelous and complete. In its essence, it is empty and quiescent. Merit of this sort cannot be sought in this world. So this is an illustration of exactly what we're talking about, right? Emperor did all this stuff. He's looking for earthly rewards, and probably did it with a very sincere heart. He's looking for some kind of earthly reward, and because of that, he misses out on the real merit, which you cannot find in this samsaric world of form and separation. So, it's the acts done on the basis of emptiness and wisdom and compassion that are the purest and most beneficial acts, and those are the ones that heap up the most merit, right? So wisdom, or prajna, is a really important part of this thing. So emptiness, again, is the teaching that conditioned things have no fixed permanent self-nature that persists through time. So they're empty of any kind of fixed identity. It's not emptiness like they don't exist. It's not that these things he did don't exist, or that these monasteries he built or whatever don't exist. Emptiness is that it has no fixed identity, no fixed permanent nature. So as soon as we realize emptiness, we also realize non-separation. And non-separation is a really important part of this thing. So it's when we deeply understand and experience non-separation that this transfer of merit actually happens. Suddenly the barrier goes down and the transfer is not hindered, right? The sharing of this is not hindered or blocked. So the ability to share or transfer merit is actually a key characteristic for bodhisattvas. That means bodhisattvas really need to deeply understand non-separation. And that means prajna, seeing the way Buddha sees. So, in the Karanda Vyuha Sutra, a bodhisattva asks Buddha how much merit Avalokiteshvara has accumulated. What an interesting question. Here's Avalokiteshvara, the bodhisattva of compassion. And somebody wants to know, how much merit has this being generated? Well, Buddha gives a lot of examples. And he says, if you were to provide robes and food and bowls and bedding and seats and medicines and utensils to all the Buddhas and all the Arhats for an unimaginable length of time, that merit would be the same as the tip of one hair on the body of Avalokiteshvara. So like an unimaginable amount of merit. It says, or if it was raining over the whole world all the time and you were able to count the drops of rain, or if you were able to count all the drops of water in all the oceans, all of that is less than the merits of Avalokiteshvara. Or if you counted all the hairs on all the four-legged animals in the world, or all the leaves on all the trees of the forest, it would be less than the merits of Avalokiteshvara. So, and he goes on like this. He gives example after example. So, point being, right, Avalokiteshvara has accumulated so much merit, is such a high-level bodhisattva that you could do all these unimaginably huge things and you wouldn't even come close. So Avalokiteshvara has a lot to work with in saving beings, right? I mean, we look at Avalokiteshvara as this wonderfully effective bodhisattva. There's lots of stories about Avalokiteshvara appearing in various guises, right? 1,000 hands and arms, and is able to run around saving beings. Well, here's part of the engine of that, right? This huge amount of merit that this bodhisattva has generated. So the power of his or her, we don't know. Practice, wisdom, compassion generates a tremendous amount of merit, which then gets thrown right back to suffering beings. Help them awaken, help liberate them from their suffering. So in the broadest sense, of course, there is no such thing as reward or merit or beings who generate merit or own it or heap it up or give it away, right? So in a sense, it's given away as soon as it arises. You can't really accumulate it because in the world of non-separation, it's given away, if you will, immediately. There's no clinging to it. There's no grasping it. There's no heaping it up. It's just Jiju Yudzamai, right? Total dynamic functioning of this universe. So Dogen gives us an example of this when he writes about being the tenzo, or the cook, for the community. Rejoice in your birth into the world, where you are capable of using your body freely to offer food to the three treasures, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Considering the innumerable possibilities in a timeless universe, we have been given a marvelous opportunity. The merit of working as a tenzo will never decay. The merit of working as a tenzo will never decay. My sincerest desire is that you exhaust all the strength and effort of all your lives, past, present, and future, and every moment of every day into your practice through the work of the tenzo, so that you form a strong connection with the Buddha Dharma. To view all things with this attitude is called joyful mind. So earlier in the week, this week, in the Wednesday book group, we read something from Katagiri Roshi. The thing that we happen to be reading at the moment is Katagiri Roshi's commentary on the Shishobo. And we happened to read something that he wrote about giving. And he says, if we can practice giving in a selfless way, with an understanding of non-separation, the merit of giving reaches at once to all beings, and all beings are in a position to receive it. This is the part you remember this? We started to discuss, like, what does that mean? Thus, the relationships of practicers and all beings create an endless, agile interconnection and interpenetration. When we do zazen, we have to cast the pebble into the ocean first. The ripples caused by this action are forms, the doing of zazen. Do zazen spreads endlessly everywhere, just like ripples. From this aspect, zazen, as the practice of giving, is a great universal activity disclosed in personal practice. And that's really interesting. The things we call good deeds, done by this person or some individual, are forms completely expressing the emptiness of total dynamic functioning in this universe. So in a way, there's no person, there's no being that can heap up merit separately from other beings. Because we're really, really talking here about completely interpenetrated Jiju Yudzamai activity. So after we read that in the group, we started thinking about how the nature of giving, the nature of our giving, affects somebody else's ability to receive that. So if we can practice giving in a selfless way, with an understanding of non-separation, the merit of giving reaches at once to all beings, and all beings are in a position to receive it. And we thought, well, so what are we doing as givers that's enabling or hindering somebody receiving that? So we kind of thought about that. How is what we're doing affecting receiving? So are we giving in a selfless way, which is based on prajna, based on emptiness, or are we giving based on three poisonous minds, greed, anger, and ignorance, in order to get something for ourselves, including perhaps a good feeling from being a helpful, wonderful bodhisattva? right? I'm such a good person because I'm doing these things. I'm deserving of merit because I'm building monasteries and printing sutras, right? So if there's any stickiness there, there's no reward for us, no merit that we can dedicate to other beings. So the nature of our giving absolutely affects the potential for someone to receive this, right? If we're doing good deeds, doing wonderful things with a little bit of stickiness that says, I'm in this for me, the merit immediately, the reward immediately goes away. So isn't that interesting? What we're doing really affects the ability of someone to receive that merit and have that be effective for them. So in that group, we also read and discussed Todo-san's comments on beneficial action. According to Dogen, beneficial action will return to those who perform them. Beneficial actions will return to those who perform them without any expectation of reward. So here's a paradox. When a person performs a beneficial action without expecting any reward, that person receives some benefit in return for that action. However, if a person helps others with some expectation of a reward, such actions essentially become a means of barter, therefore producing no reward. According to Dogen, actions can either be defiled or pure, depending upon the motivation of the person performing them. If a person performs a generous act without any expectation of personal gain, although rewards for the action are not important to that person, the person does receive a reward. If the person has even the slightest expectation of any reward, however, the action is defiled, and the person definitely is not rewarded. What strange logic. So it's not just enough to do good acts. I'm going to go out there and generate merit by doing good acts. As bodhisattvas, we have to do those acts based on seeing them the way Buddha sees, right? Based on wisdom and compassion. Based on seeing the true reality of all beings and the interpenetration of how this universe actually works. So it's not, we're not doing these things just because somebody says so, just because we read in a book, well, this is a meritorious act, or this is a good thing to do, or this is beneficial action. We're not doing them because we want to be liked, or because we want to think of ourselves as good people. All that stuff is stickiness, right? The reward goes away. So that means it's important to practice. It's important for us to practice and to cultivate our wisdom and compassion if we're going to really generate true merit for beings. It sort of has to come from the right place. So otherwise, it would be easy to just sort of take a list of precepts. We just did precepts here. It would be easy to take a list of precepts and just kind of follow the list without a second thought. Do this, don't do that, and check that off and go there, job done. Right? That's what bodhisattva action looks like, or those are the things that generate merit. Well, of course, we know it's not that easy. It would be great if someone could hand us a list or a book and say, do these things. Here's the checklist for generating merit. Of course, it doesn't work that way. If I don't see or understand for myself out of my own direct experience, this distinct but not separate, this non-separation, this completely interpenetrated functioning, if that doesn't come from my own understanding, my own experience, then I can't fully generate merit and I can't transfer it to you, even if I really want to do that. Even if I really have an aspiration to do good in the world, there's still a little hindrance in there. So if we think it doesn't matter about our practice, well, I'll just take the list of good deeds and go do those things. Well, it doesn't really matter if I'm not doing the practice around it. It matters. The things we're doing are sticky. So we're creating hindrance for ourselves. I can have good intention. I can have aspiration. Some hindrance is still going to get in the way, and that hindrance is my delusion. So in order to be bodhisattvas, we do have to sort of take on our own practice. We have to remove our own hindrances. We have to cultivate our own wisdom. Otherwise, whatever we're generating is sticky, right? It's not completely effective for helping beings. So the gate statement again, accretion of happiness or accumulation of merit, if you want to read it that way, is a gate of Dharma-Illumination, for it benefits all living beings. So how do we use merit to benefit all beings? So now we get to talk about the field of merit. Now we have to talk about what is a field of merit, or fukuden. Now, you might not think you know this image, or you might not think you know this word fukuden until you think about the robe chant. So if you're here in the mornings, or if you wear any of these things, great robe of liberation, virtuous field far beyond form and emptiness, sometimes translated a formless field of merit. That's the first translation I learned in Minnesota, a formless field of merit, right? In Japanese, Daisai Gerepuku Muso Fukudenne. So we're very familiar with this. This one's checking the back of his Rakusu. Yes, it's there. It's there. So what is a field of merit? We just think that's, what an interesting image that is. So whatever receives our gifts, our offerings, our dedications is a field of merit. Now that's interesting, right? I don't think about it that way. So this recipient, whatever the recipient is like a field that we cultivate by planting good seeds. So good karmic actions have good karmic results, result in and giving results in merit. That's the way this is set out in our tradition. So I think another way to consider the robe as a field of merit is the teaching that anything we're doing while wearing a robe is a seed of prajna. So as soon as we put these things on, whether physically or by aspiration, whatever we're doing wearing this robe, whatever we're doing under bodhisattva vows, is a seed for a seed of prajna. So the field is not only in this way the recipient of our dedications, it's also the ground, it's also the container, right, of those dedications. So it's both a cultivation of wisdom and a manifestation of wisdom. And again, we have this turning constantly interpenetrated functioning. So with regard to the robe, the field metaphor, of course, comes from this traditional story where Buddha said we need some way to distinguish the folks in our Sangha from folks doing other kinds of practices. And he asks Ananda to come up with a robe pattern based on the rice field, what a rice field looks like. So for us, this field also represents this sort of day-to-day world of our activities and our responsibilities, and this is where we carry out our bodhisattva practice. There's nowhere to practice other than here and now, right? We're not going to go somewhere else to do that. So imagine our field of day-to-day activity as the ground, the recipient, the container, the source, the place of all these seeds of prajna that we're planting to generate, and not to generate merit, but generating merit, because we're helping all beings. So unfolding and wearing the Tathagata's teachings is what we literally do. Following that robe verse, we unfold these things and we put them on. But we also carry and share the Dharma in the world, making it available to others, embodying practice and teachings. So, for the purposes of being in here, we may physically wear these things, but I always feel like I do the robe chant, I put this on in the morning, I may take it off, to take out the trash or to go about my daily life, but I haven't actually taken it off. And then we come the next morning and we do the same thing again. Have we actually ever taken this robe off? I don't think so, right? So when we put it on in the morning in a formal way to remind ourselves, what is this field of merit? What is this thing about, generating merit and planting seeds and doing good work? But do we ever really take this off? I would argue we don't. So we're generating merit by helping beings to awaken. But here's the thing, the amount of merit that gets generated depends on the condition of the field in which those seeds are planted. So the more kind of prepared and worthy or something the recipient is, the greater the merit. So if we're planting seeds in the right place, under the right conditions, we're generating more merit. So it's just like planting seeds in a fertile field. We're going to get a whole lot more crops than planting seeds in poor soil. So there are writings in the canon that say, if the bodhisattva is asked to give up his life for another being, he or she has to actually decide whether that recipient of that life has as much compassion as the bodhisattva does. What is that recipient going to do with that offering? So the bodhisattva has to decide whether giving up that life will enable the recipient to save more beings than the bodhisattva could save. So isn't that interesting? This is not about blind giving. This is about thinking carefully, being strategic. This is about being wise about giving. Are we out there just doing any old thing to the detriment of ourselves or other beings because we have some idea about what giving is, about what merit is? We actually have to think about, where are we planting seeds and under what conditions? Our resources are limited, right? In this form, we're limited human beings. We can't do everything. Goodness knows, in the last week, we've all been looking at each other and saying, we can't do any more. We have to be thoughtful, right, about where we plant seeds, how we plant seeds in our aspiration. to generate merit. So the two richest fields of merit are said to be the Buddha and the Sangha. So giving to the Buddha, giving to the Sangha is supposed to generate the most merit. Again, because Buddha and practitioners who follow his teachings are actively maintaining precepts, actively sitting, cultivating wisdom. Those are the three parts of the Eightfold Path, right? So giving to Buddha and giving to Buddha, people who practice in Buddha's way, multiplies the merit, if you will, because there's already practice happening. There's already wisdom being cultivated. So if you give to the Buddha and, yes, monks, traditionally monks, if you give to the Buddha and monks, you get a share of the merit that they generate because you're helping to make that possible. So enabling the liberation of beings in some way, whether, maybe you're not directly liberating beings, maybe you're enabling the liberation of beings, is still a merit-producing activity. So it's still good to help, right? So one other way that Sangha is a huge field of merit, interestingly, has to do with Ango. So we've just finished an Ango, our practice period. I mean, literally within the last, couple of weeks. And that is supposed to be, the Ango itself is a huge field of merit. So when a Sangha practices together during 3 months in this, in a sort of intensive way, and that's kind of what we do, right? I mean, we always think of practice period as being a fairly intensive time of practice. Traditionally, that's when everybody, went into the quote-unquote monastery and kind of shut the door during the rainy season, and they were practicing intensively together. Here what we do, we have a number of fairly intensive activities that we do. We usually traditionally have had a Genzo-e, we have a Sesshin, we've got a number of work days that we do. So we do Zazen work and study. That's intentional on Todo-san's part. That's how we set up the Ango, right? There's a Shuso, there's a head student, right, giving talks. There are ceremonies at the end of that Shuso term. There's a lot happening. It's an intensive time. Ango is intended to be an intensive time. So traditionally, twice in the year, we kind of look inward and we intensify, and then the rest of the time we open up again, and we have this rhythmic kind of feel to our year. So the Ango is an intensive practice, and it is itself a large field of merit, because when everybody comes together and practices intensively as a community, supposedly, we are generating a mighty supernatural power. Right? All of our practice energy is gathering, and we're creating a mighty supernatural power. So because of the vast store of merit that is accumulated with the sustained intensive practice by a community of practitioners, then all that merit can be used to save the hungry ghosts in the hell realms. And these are the beings that are so far gone that they can't be reached in any other way. So I think that's an interesting part of our tradition, which I was not familiar with until I started sort of looking around about merit, right? So, one of the side benefits of the Ango is that we take all of that generated merit and wisdom and compassion and throw that back to these beings in the hell realms that can't be saved in any other way. So we're really working together, right, to save these beings. So, you thought Ango was just about having a Shuso and a Hosenshiki. Actually, we're doing something else there. We're generating merit to save beings in the hell realm. So I'll just leave you with one other thing. Within the Tibetan Vajrayana tradition, I hear some folks actually do a little dedication of merit every time at the end of their sitting period. So if you're sitting at home, or even you're sitting with a group, some people make it a practice to do a little bit of a dedication of merit for themselves at the end of that period. So someone who tried it said it really changed her attitude. It changed the quality of her sitting, because her sitting was really now not about just her. We hear those teachings and we go, yeah, and we internalize, right? But just the act of like consciously getting up from the cushion and saying, I'm dedicating this to, all beings or whatever. The habit, the ritual of that really changed the quality of her sitting. So, stops being about us, stops being about her, starts being about the beings. So it might be interesting to try in our own personal practice. Write yourself a little 1-line or 2-line verse. There's no, if you want to follow echo form, you can, but in this case, it's about your intention, right? Maybe you come up with a little something to say for yourself. You hear the bell ring at home or here, and as you're getting ready to stand up, you've got a little something you say silently to yourself about throwing that merit back. Just sort of rededicating that energy, rededicating the merit to all beings besides ourselves. So, what would you all like to say about merit, generating merit, accumulating merit, what that might mean in our own practice, or anything that's bubbling for you, starting with people in the room? I was going to keep that short, and I kind of didn't. A little bit short. Yes, you do. The mouth opens and stuff comes out, and then Nelly bar the door. What would people like to say about any of that? Either from your own practice or people who have some scholastic background and want to fill in some colorful context.
I guess, so this is kind of a pessimistic viewpoint, but I feel like, in light of, the past few weeks when we've been experiencing multiple hottest days on record, and continuing heat waves all over the world, it has me thinking about how just going about our daily lives as sort of people living in a rich country, we're hurting all beings all the time, just by default. And it seems like on balance, we're always going to be doing kind of more negative stuff to the planet as long as we keep living in the way that we're living. But of course we can, maybe if you take the economy of merit sort of view, offset that somewhat by doing good things. So I guess my question is kind of, how do you think of merit in that sort of context? Like, it would be difficult to function in our society without doing a lot of these kind of negative things.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, if we continue doing them, we're kind of leading all beings to a bad place.
Yeah, there's no question. So I think for me, I can't see merit as separate from things like vow and repentance.
Mm-hmm.
I can't see merit as separate from things like skillful action, beneficial action, looking largely at in the larger context at the Shishobo. So, do I think that sitting zazen during Ango is going to save the world by itself? No. And I think in modern America we get a chance to sort of think about, and that's kind of the question I'm posing, like, how does this fit into our practice, if it fits at all? So traditionally, of course, we were heaping up merit in order to leap off the wheel of samsara and be reborn, hopefully as monks, so that we could, make the final leap. And so there was very much, I love the term economy of merit. I think that's great. There was very much about we were going to save up this merit and spend it for our own salvation, right? Okay, so in this culture, that's kind of not how we approach it. So I think we don't talk so much about merit. So it's interesting to sort of think about that. So to me, I can't divorce it from beneficial action, skillful action, cultivation of prajna, and taking responsibility as a bodhisattva for the harm that we do. So having just spent a week talking about precepts, one of the things that always comes up is sometimes we have to break a precept, right, in order for some larger good. And then we take responsibility for that. We don't go doing that saying, oh, well, it's okay because I'm a bodhisattva. We have to actually take responsibility for that. So I think merit is an interesting gateway into thinking about the results, the karmic results of my actions, but I don't think it's enough. I don't think we can take it away from the other teachings that say we need to be thinking about unwholesomeness and skillful means and seeing clearly and three poisons and all this stuff that goes with what you're talking about. So, I don't think we can go out there and do small meritorious actions and then hope that the planet will stop being on fire. But it might be, if I decide after every sitting period, at the end of this, I'm going to dedicate that to beings, it might be the thing that reminds me that says, oh yeah, don't do that harmful thing that dumps point source pollution into the river, right? It might be the thing that says, oh yeah, I was meaning to read that book and educate myself about something, right? I think if our practice with merit does nothing more than sort of remind us about our aspiration, I think in that way it has some value. So this is kind of why I'm challenging us all to think about how does that actually fit into my personal practice? If I don't live in an economy of merit within my practice, like, is there some value there for me? And I think there kind of is, but I don't think we can take it out of context. Look, we can't take so much of our practice out of context, right? Do you have a follow-up or anything you want to add to that?
I think that's a great answer. It's kind of an impossible question.
It is. Well, and as Tomosan has said forever, we take these bodhisattva vows, but we don't get to them. It takes more than forever, right? We don't get to those things by the end of our lifetime, and so it can be really discouraging. Like, why am I taking precepts? I'm going to go right out and break them. Why am I taking bodhisattva vows? I'm never going to get to the end of that, and we just get paralyzed. So even if what Merit says is even a small action has some karmic fruit, and even if that's enough to just get me back on the cushion in this world on fire, maybe that's all we can hope for some days, please. And so you and then Donna.
When I'm seeing it as merit is kind of like the seed implanted that melts cynicism.
Interesting.
That because you can't have this. I mean, the danger of thinking about merit is that there's this ossified personality that's grabbing merit, and so that idea of melting away any cynicism comes with that idea of merit.
So practicing with generation of merit keeps us from becoming inflexible and clinging to our need to shore up five skandhas?
Yes.
Yeah, interesting.
Yes.
Good. Donna, you had something too, and then Ritoku.
I keep listening to this, but a word that just keeps coming in my head is honor. And I don't quite see, and I know that, so I think about, okay, so dedication of merit, then that could be honor, but visually, honor for me is like quiet waters. And maybe that's just a little loose association here this morning, but trying to understand how it is that we honor not only individuals but honor our earth and as we move through these merits.
Yeah. So we can think about honor. We can also think about respect. What is it to respect the things that come into our lives and the things that we encounter? Ippyakuhachi-Homyomon Roshi says, wouldn't it be interesting if everything we encountered we could see as our child? Not like we're going to talk down to it and we're going to, it's like, but there's a duty of care in a certain kind of way, right? So the core, and Sagan can help me here, the core of respect is to see, right? To see something clearly. To look again at something. Are we actually seeing what's in front of us and honoring that, respecting it, caring for it in a wise and compassionate way? Or are we simply blindly going through life attached to those three poisons, right? So to think about honoring things is an interesting approach to that. It opens a certain kind of gateway, right? Ritoku, I think you had something to add. Did I see your hand up back there somewhere? Oh, and then Jeff?
Yeah. Well, I like the word honor. I hear that word a lot in indigenous communities.
Oh, yeah.
The problem with the techno-industrial world is it doesn't properly honor the earth. But the thing that came to mind while you were talking about merit, and I particularly like that you brought up bodhisattva because that's one of the, that's a virtual Koan I worked with for years. No merit? What do you mean no merit? But we have in our tradition here that Zen is good for nothing. So if you sit down in Zen with the intention that you're going to accomplish something, that's not Zen, right?
Well, it's sticky enough that you're not generating merit in a way that you can transfer it.
Well, I think merit is also like that. That if you do something deliberately for the purposes of generating merit, then you're already setting up a duality, a separation between you and something else. Right. And that becomes, as the Bodhisattva says, of this world. Yes. Rather than the merit of nirvana, which is no separation.
Yes, exactly. I think it's an interesting conundrum. Right? Jeff had something to add as well.
Yeah, it was more of a question. It seemed to me that, starting with Doju's questions, and then adding to it something you had referred to, is that wisdom would be to evaluate every action in terms of the magnitude of the effect it would have, or the meritorious effect it would have on others. And we've moved away in our formulations, not just these little hints about what we could do that would improve our perspective, but we would be really calculating
when I encounter that teaching, my first thought is, wow, that sounds really kind of, there's a certain amount of clinging to a result, and it doesn't feel like it fits with our teaching. But I think it absolutely fits when we, in this day and age, we talk about things like idiot compassion. And I think what this is doing is getting us to not fall down that rabbit hole that says everybody that wants something from me, oh, the compassion thing is to give everybody what they want, whether that hurts me or them or anything. Where are we deploying resources? You know, we want to do that in a way that is really about liberating beings in the most effective possible way. I'm sure that there will be times where that results in hard choices. I mean, goodness knows Sanshin has limited resources. We like to save all beings. You know, we can't do it at one time. We're going to have to be thoughtful about where, you know, what seeds we plant and where we deploy those resources. So I think, in a way, it feels, there's something that feels not, like it doesn't fit, right? Because, you know, as bodhisattva, we want to save all beings, and we shouldn't be picking and choosing, because there's lots of teachings that say we don't pick and choose who we help. So on the one hand, we have to balance, we don't pick and choose who we help. And on the other hand, we have to say, and our resources are limited. And there may be some conditions where planting certain seeds is just not helpful. Might be harmful, but it at least might not be helpful. So where, as bodhisattvas, where do we do our work in the most effective possible way? And I think that has everything to do with using our karmic conditions as bodhisattvas. There are certain things I'm good at, and there's certain things I'm not good at. You know, there are plenty of people in robes who are very good at pastoral care. They have deep training in pastoral care. I am not one of them. So am I going to, if I decide I'm really going to, you know, feel like I want to do that kind of work, I have some remedial work to do. I have to train myself. I have to get some skills. If I just walk in there and try to do that work, I'll either do it poorly or I'll actually hurt somebody, right? So I mean, I think given we have certain karmic circumstances. We have things we're good at. We have things we have opportunities to experience. Let's use those things in the best possible way. Let's plant the right seeds in the right place. So I think as long as those choices are coming from wisdom and compassion as a bodhisattva, as opposed to I like this person, I don't like this person, so I'm going to help this one or not that one, that's the pitfall, right? It's like, I think you're pretty, or I think you're smart, or I think you're worthy, or, you know, if it's based on our sort of personal picking and choosing, we've got a problem. If we're doing that as bodhisattvas and saying strategically, how do I liberate the most possible beings, I think that's a different conversation. But I think it's really subtle, right? So this is an interesting intersection. Until I was preparing this talk, I hadn't kind of put that intersection, I kind of hadn't built that intersection. I think there's some interesting creative tension in there, right, that we get to like mess with. I love these gate statements because they make me intersect stuff that I would never intersect, and just something interesting often comes out of that. I think that's one of them. How do we be the most effective bodhisattvas we can be, and yet not pick and choose who we help? I don't have a good answer for that. You know, it's really kind of interesting. Is there anything you want to follow up on about that?
No.
It bears sitting with. Yeah, right? Because I don't think there's an easy answer. We can't be everything to everybody. And yet, we vow to save all beings. It takes more than forever. How do we do that? I don't know, you know. Other things in this room? Comments, questions, reflections? Please.
I'm curious about what you're saying that for the recipient of your action to be able to receive the merit of what you're doing, you need to have no particular expectation of reward. Yes. Curious about kind of two things about that, and one's the difference between being able to like predict or anticipate a certain outcome as opposed to expecting it.
Yep.
And then the other part would be if the outcome that you predict or anticipate might actually be maybe challenging for both you or for them, but it nonetheless still feels like the kind of meritorious thing to do.
Yeah. So of course, you know, we do good actions. We can't possibly predict the outcome completely. So we set our good intention. We are as skillful as we can be. We do the best job we can do. We put it out there, and then we have to open our hands, because it might go down the road we anticipate, and it might go completely not. And then we get to respond to that. This is why this is a moment by moment by moment, right? We can't just go, that's the goal, and then we're going straight there. We don't know. So we have to have good intention, and then vow and repentance, we have to take responsibility if it goes off the rails, right? That we know our practice is incomplete. So we also can't anticipate always how that action would be received by somebody else. If it's challenging, if it's uncomfortable, that doesn't necessarily make it not a meritorious action, right? We comfort the afflicted and we afflict the comfortable. Sometimes the helpful thing is to point out to somebody, something which isn't easy to say. Can we do that with wisdom and compassion, or are we doing that to get something here? Am I doing that to prove that I'm better than you? Am I doing that, for some way to build up my own 5 skandhas, right? So can it be a challenge? Sure. I think that's why bodhisattva activity is not so easy sometimes. To know how to do that skillfully is also not easy, right? So, if we make people uncomfortable, if we say to people we need to challenge the way we live, if we're going along complacently, buying everything we want and dumping it in landfills, sometimes we have to say, that's not okay. People don't like that message. They want to be comfortable, right? But sometimes that's the thing to do. So, this is all, we get to balance it. So this is why we have to keep coming back to cultivating our own practice. Cultivating our own wisdom and compassion to know how to make choices, and then to take responsibility for what happens. We do our best and then we make mistakes. That's our life as human bodhisattvas. Other things folks would like to say in the room? Sawyer, please.
So, I finally started reading a book that you lent me, which has, I think the title is Chinese Buddhism and Society. And I was looking at a part that was about how the temple related to, they lived in basically an agricultural society, and how the monasteries sort of got their food. And at least in some parts of China at some times, there was a tradition of sort of the monastery owned lands, and they would lease the lands out to, sort of basically peasant farmers. And the farmers would grow food and pay basically like a tax to the monastery. So the monastery was like generating income off of farm laborers, and not even actually eating that food. I think they would just receive the income and then go to market and get something else. And that the idea behind it was that like a merit. It generated merit for the farmers to be contributing
to the
money
temple
to support the temple. And I think there's all sorts of iterations of that throughout Buddhism in all sorts of countries and times. And I think probably most of us are aware that we're starting to try to source some food from local farms around here as much as possible for retreats. And I wanted to share this interesting, I think I shared it with you, this for one of the sesshin recently. We got like an emailed invoice from the farm I work at, actually, because we used their produce. And he gave us the invoice, and then he said, "Thank you for supporting local farms." And it was an interesting moment of like a reversal in a sense of this long history of the farms are like just supporting the temple because it's a meritorious thing to do, and you generate merit, and maybe you'll be reborn later as a monk or something. And now we're in this position where we're like basically we're paying the farmers who are, and the economic conditions of farming are so strange in these times. So that feels like when we're talking about transference of merit, it feels like something is happening there. And
Yeah.
wonder-
I love the mutuality of that, right?
Yeah.
Because they're allowing us to sit and practice, because they're feeding us, they're giving us healthy food, not giving us healthy, but they're providing us healthy food. So they're allowing our practice. And if we want to look broadly, there's some merit in that, but we're also enabling that growing to happen, right? So I love the mutuality of that. So yeah, it's an interesting refashioning, isn't it, of the whole traditional system, right? I mean, some of those temples became very, very wealthy. People were feeling quite threatened by some of those temples because they owned so much land. They're making so much money, So was there pure intention behind all of that? I don't know. I don't know. Temples became an economic power in some of those societies. So I think I just think it's really interesting how we're building these relationships with local food growers. I just love the circle of that, right? So I think we can put our own wholesome spin on that system based on our own karmic circumstances today. And I'm glad you're coordinating that, because I think that's an interesting practice for us all, right? To just see how that works, investigate how that works. Plus, it's nice to have good, local, fresh food to support our practice. When we come in from the Zendo, having sat 5 periods in Sesshin, we come in and there's nice local produce. There's something that feels good about that, right? It didn't get trucked in from somewhere, it wasn't picked in an immature state and ripened artificially and all that stuff. It feels like, not only are we supporting that sort of human economic system, but there's something that's nice about this is local ground. And we're growing the food on our local ground and we're consuming it and practicing here. So I think this is happening in multiple directions. So I just want to sort of continue as a Sangha to explore those intersections, because I think something interesting is happening there. Other reflections about that or other things, please?
Yeah, just thought I'd quickly add to that, and I sort of alluded to it, but going back to what Jeff was saying and what you were saying about sort of this idea of kind of calculating the effect of your actions.
Right.
Following up on what Sawyer said, that model, of course, was extremely bad for Buddhism in the long run. Because, in China, for example, the Buddhist establishment was seen as a feudal landlord.
Yeah.
Which they basically were.
Yeah.
And
very powerful, and not always clean.
And it was the same in Korea and Japan also.
Yep.
To a lesser backlash, I guess, but still a backlash.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that again we have to be really careful with this idea of merit and sort of especially in sort of the traditional sense of just anything that you do
Sure.
at a temple must be good.
We can tell ourselves a lot of stories, right, about who we are and in relation to our support for the temple. So I kind of like that we're forging this different kind of model, and maybe reversing some of that just a little bit. I like that there's this kind of mutual support happening there. And I'm pretty sure nobody's ever going to come after Sanchin as a powerful feudal landlord, because, we own the acre we sit on, and, and that's about it. So, yeah, interesting, isn't it, to make that reversal. Good. Okay, other things in this room? Folks at home, Sawyer can manage if you have something to say. Golly, I didn't talk very long, but this is a topic people are chewing on, so that's okay.
Looks like Mahesh.
So I have a question on that person who was dedicating their merit of their sitting, and then the quality of their sitting seems to have improved. So whenever we dedicate this merit, we want to benefit others, but then there is something in the back of our mind that overall it's going to be good for us too, like the sitting quality improves, or like overall in terms of letting go of this self-centeredness or ego, it's a good thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
If it is really not at all good, and if it just goes to everyone, then I wonder how we relate to it.
Yeah. Well, so if we're dedicating merit to all beings, we're beings too. So dedicating merit to all beings doesn't exclude us. And so maybe that benefit looks different for us than it looks for other beings, but if we turn around and dedicate the merit of our sitting to all beings, we're not excluding our own, we're not excluding that we're helping ourselves as well, right? So if we're clinging to how that helps, we have a problem. But if we also think we're excluded, we have a problem. Right? So, just like any other result of our sitting, there may be some benefit for us in our sitting, but we're not sitting in order to receive that reward. We're not clinging to that reward. We're doing the sitting because we do the sitting. Something good may happen. Something good may not happen. But we can certainly dedicate that energy to all beings and include ourselves. I don't think that's separate, right? Other things from people?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, I don't want to make things longer than they need to be. But just to say, in terms of fields of merit, a distinction between fields where, we might plant seeds that would yield certain results or that they're ready to receive the seeds. I think that's, for me, this feels a little bit like perhaps taking the easy way out. I mean, I understand it, but and there are multiple examples of this. But even if we think about the kind of the obvious issue of political divisions, for example, I think that at least in my environment, there's so many individuals, organizations who avoid certain kinds of discussions or are not skillful in knowing how to open certain kinds of discussions because the assumption is, oh, this is not a beneficial field to seeds. We have limited amounts of skills and energy and understanding, and we tend to invest those in areas where we expect some benefit or success, actually. And I think maybe it's important to balance that, and we need that, of course, but to balance that with actually some of the places which seem kind of almost impossible, and because we really don't know. I mean, I can think of examples where some seeds were planted in areas that absolutely it looked like it was, feudal, but then it could be decades later,
Right.
that something grows out of it.
Yep.
So
Well,
I was just wondering about that particular definition of what makes for a field of merit where we should be engaged in.
Yeah. So I think you made an important point. So a fertile field of merit is not necessarily the one that generates the result quickly or easily, right? The fertile field of merit could be, well, we've got to play the long game. There's an opportunity to liberate a bunch of beings. It's going to take us a while. We have to train ourselves. We have to gain some skills. We have to pull together some resources. We have to make a plan, right? That could be a wonderfully fertile field of merit, but it might not bear fruit for 20 years. I think Sanshin's an example, but I wasn't intending to go there, right? So I think the fertile field of merit is not the thing that's done most easily necessarily, or the thing that's done most quickly. It's what has the greatest opportunity, the greatest potential for liberating beings. That can take a long time, and it can be a whole ton of work. So this is not saying, I think this is not saying avoid the difficult conversation, that's not a worthy place to plant seeds. I think it's saying look carefully at the potential for liberating beings and take care of those things, right? So I think you're not wrong in that, and I'm glad you brought it up because my intention was not to say do the easy thing, right? Do the simple thing. Play the long game sometimes, right? Sometimes we have to do that. Other folks at home? Are we ready to move along to our ceremony?